Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Unseen Paranormal, the return of the Unseen Paranormal. After our little break, I am your host as usual, Eric Freeman Sims. Thank y'all for tuning in today. You got an awesome guest that I don't know why I haven't had him on the show. Kind of slipped through the cracks, I guess. He's been on my friends list on Facebook for a long time, and I've kept up with him because he's a parapsychologist and a very interesting guy. He teaches psychology and parapsychology at a university in England, and he's a member of the Society for Psychical Research in England as well, and lots of other things going on. And so today we are kind of just picking his brain about all the different topics in the paranormal. And some of us ghost people kind of think the paranormal is just ghosts, but it's not. Paranormal is a huge umbrella with cryptids and, poltergeists and psychokinesis and all these different weird things, UFOs and all that stuff. It all falls under the paranormal. So kind of picking his brain about all the different aspects of paranormal. And then we also are talking about his book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, which was originally published in 2012, but he has a second edition, revised and updated edition that is out now on Amazon and Kindle. And Dr. Callum Cooper, what a brilliant guy and a joy to talk to. And I love having these conversations where I don't necessarily completely agree with my guests on some of the things, but it's nice to have some of these conversations and dive into different topics. So we will have him back on the show, and the next time that I have him on, we're going to dive more into his research and kind of more focused topics instead of kind of the ADD jumping around. And also next week's episode, we'll get back into more of the talking the mental health stuff. But thank you all for allowing me to take a break and then coming back and listening to the show. I couldn't do this without y'all. I really appreciate it. Everything's gotten really crazy busy this year, which is a really good thing. And I've got some really cool announcements coming up. In the next couple of weeks, I will be in another magazine called Canvas Rebel in Nashville. It is a local magazine, and but I will post that article up online. It's just talking about being a creative, not even talking about the show necessarily, but being a creative person and things like that. So that was very cool that they asked me to do that. And I couldn't do any of this without all of y'all. So thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the show and being fans of the show and being so loyal. It really, really means a lot to me. And anyway, without any further ado, we're going to get on with Dr. Callum Cooper. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. We'll talk to you next time. Hey, everybody. Today, we welcome Dr. Cal Cooper to the show. He is a parapsychologist and a psychologist and a lecturer. And we wanted to bring him on the show. He's got the second edition of his book out now. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Telephone Calls from the Dead, and also him as a parapsychologist and a skeptic, and to get his opinions on some of the things that he thinks. So thanks for joining us today, Cal.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's good to be here.
So how did you become interested in the paranormal to begin with? Just kind of get into this journey of parapsychology and psychology and just start this whole journey.
I suppose it began with my upbringing in Nottingham. There's a lot of places locally that boast being the oldest pub in the world. My grandmother was very encouraging of talking about people's ghostly experiences. She attended a few talks by a local ghostwriter called Jane Peters, who would go out and interview people locally about their experiences at local pubs and known buildings, all the way through to popular sites such as Newstead Abbey, which was the former home of the poet Lord Byron. And I used to go on a lot of walks and picnics there with my grandmother, and she would tell me about stories of Bosun the dog, which was Byron's dog, the White Lady, the Goblin Friar, all of these apparitions that people had allegedly encountered over the years and through to modern day. Some so surprising that the White Lady had been seen at a bus stop and had been so convincing as an actual person stood there dressed in white that bus drivers had pulled over to let this lady in the middle of the night on. And so that stuff fascinated me, that when you read these accounts, people seemed to be very honest and sincere. So during my schooling, when we went to the local library, I would get with 3 or 4 of the only other guys that were in my class. I was in very small class sizes. And we go to this section that had a few paranormal books. There was the Osborne Book of Ghosts. There was a couple of books on Fortean phenomena, so UFOs, Bigfoot, and Loch Ness Monster. But it went into some haunting stuff and ghosts with Harry Price, but more so to talk about Jeff the Talking Mongoose, which he investigated on the Isle of Man. So that always fascinated me. I'd gone through a whole sequence of performing arts, and I wanted to get into theatre and performance. But I saw so many people going down the qualification route. When I finally came to being 16 and starting to make my choices, I was sculpting my way through college to work for a psychology degree. I had that to fall back on if acting didn't work out for me. But in doing that, I looked at different universities and recognized that some were teaching a module in the third year, so this kind of optional credit that you could take in parapsychology as well. And so that's what I did. I went to the University of Northampton. I did my psychology degree there. I focused on parapsychology, and I've stayed in academia ever since. So that's what made me a parapsychologist.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome to go all the way up to parapsychology. But I also find psychology fascinating. So figuring out why people do what they do and why they think what they think and things. So yeah, to get into the psychology of the paranormal, and because I'm very interested in like pareidolia and things like that, because I think that's a big predominant thing in the paranormal that people throw out the window, especially with pictures that are just lens flares and things, and people don't want to hear the real explanation of, okay, it's just like you see a elephant in the clouds. Your brain's trying to make sense of something that it can't make sense of. And people don't understand also that you can do that with audio. Things that you're listening to, like EVPs and sounds and things like that. You know, your brain is it wants to make sense of the chaos. And so, yeah, I find the psychology of it interesting as well. And also how so many people are confirmation biased because they want to believe that everything is paranormal, that you can't reason with them. And it's just fascinating. So that's one of the reasons I want to have you on the show, because you're also a big skeptic, and I call myself a skeptical believer. And I've had so many people tell me over the years, like, do you even believe in the paranormal as a researcher and investigator? I'm like, yeah, but I just don't believe everything's paranormal. And if there is paranormal, and I'm not going to tell you if I catch something that I can't explain, I'm not going to automatically tell you that it's a ghost either, because I don't know. Any piece of evidence I get, I can't tell you that it's actual, somebody who's crossed over or passed on. I can just tell you something out of the norm that I can explain.
Well, I'll go back to that. You said, people saying, do you even believe in the paranormal? It sounds like a bit of a dud conclusion to me, because what does that even mean? Are people wanting you, or are they going down this route of accepting in their own minds that there is something that is happening, but it's something that will forever remain permanently unexplained? What does that even mean? I mean, in every area of science, we're looking at trying to understand the next thing. There's something that we don't understand. So we ask questions, we understand where we come from, we look at the background, and then we hypothesize something and we do an empirical test to see to what extent is there good evidence for that. Yeah. If we put some controls in place and we try and measure whatever it is that we're looking for. So, when you've got day-to-day Tom, Dick, or Harry saying, believe in the paranormal, that these things are permanently unexplained, stop questioning it. Well, the point of questioning it is to understand the mechanisms behind why someone believes they've had that experience. It could be that there's no conditions as to why you might have had something that appeared paranormal to your interpretation. They might not apply. So you might realize, wow, that doesn't fit the bill. So it could be something of very much interest to parapsychology, but that still means that, there's a process going on here. The only element that is paranormal is the fact that it's a current anomaly. We just don't fully understand the mechanisms, or we can't see how it fits what we do know. So we need to savor that one, put it in a box with a question mark, and give it a lot more attention. Yeah. We've literally gone through all the 10 people saying they've seen a ghost in the same place. So let's separate the wheat from the chaff of all the conventional explanations. Does it apply to everyone, or have we got at least one or two people where it doesn't apply to them? But every science is learning. There are some things that are current anomalies until we give them time to understand what they are.
The paranormal community seems to be divided when it comes to skeptical people and even parapsychologists, because a lot of people want to say that parapsychologist, is not a thing. And I don't know if they're afraid to be debunked or what the problem is, but you have half the community like me and people like that I respect and that I investigate with, who welcome the scrutiny. And, if you can come and explain anything that I've ever put out as evidence, then I welcome that. And I want the knowledge of parapsychology, like we were talking about, because of the interest of the human mind within the paranormal. But I just wonder why people are so scared of skeptics and being debunked when they're claiming that they're trying to further the field and they're actually investigators and researchers.
I think with that, we're mainly talking about ghost hunters and those that we see on social media. And, they're clearly enjoying what they're doing. It's their hobby, it's their pastime. But from a lot of what I see, even when I've done TV shows as a parapsychologist on there and as a voice of skepticism, that they are just purely pursuing pseudoscience. They're using tools and gadgets with no real rationale as to why they're doing it. They just throw them in as and when. In most of the cases, they are not trained in understanding what those devices do or what they're for. Most of them are environmental monitoring equipment. And the only reason that we've ever used them in parapsychology is exploring links behind high electromagnetic field outputs.
Right.
What impact that has on the human mind and perception. Same for infrasound, low frequency sound, temperature changes. There've been papers that have compared when you alter these things or there's unusual output in buildings and how this affects your perceptions. So that's what they're for. You don't really see them being used in that way on the TV shows or people really understanding what the EMF reading is actually telling you, except for, oh, there's a strange fluctuation here. It must be paranormal. So if you go in with a physicist or an environmental scientist who knows how to use this stuff, or the parapsychologist that explains their misperceptions, then it's taking away something from them that's quite special. When actually what everybody really wants to know is, someone has made a claim that this building is haunted. Is there any evidence for unusual goings on that don't seem to have an explanation? It's just, you've got a lot of these people that are going about it at mass and going about it the wrong way at mass. And these scientists that might come in, or whoever you describe as the thinkers, they might be in some seat of the know. And, it doesn't take a lot for them to say, you're doing it all wrong, but here's how you could do it. But it's seen as an attack and taking away something that's special to them. And the proper way to do it is probably very boring. And so that's why they might not like it. I mean, I still enjoy going along to the odd building and being invited because there's some sort of reports and what do you make of it. But it's tiring. You get very tired and it's a lot of sitting around and doing nothing and making notes. It's not running about in the dark with night vision cameras and gadgets or dictaphones to record live EVPs while you're carrying, the audio recorder in your hand. It's not how such experiments are done. It's not how data's collected. It's a far cry. But these shows have become very popular because they're thrill seeking.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the gadgets come in because they're flashing lights and it gives more of a visual. Because when I go into it is boring. It is. Most of the time, nothing happens when we go into places. And most of the things, if you hear noises and things, you can explain them, or even visual anomalies and things are easily explained if you just look into it. And that's why I do public ghost hunts for like charity, and it helps some of the historic locations make money. But when we go into that, I tell people it's like fishing. Like, we may sit here for, the next 5 hours and nothing happens. And, I explain to them that it's not like TV. And that's kind of become my role, I believe, in the paranormal world that I'm in, is trying to educate people on things like EMF meters, like you're talking about. They were brought in to rule out high EMF fields because that can cause, it's been shown in studies to cause auditory and visual hallucinations in really high. And I've even been in a house that a lady called us in to investigate, and her husband was a big gamer, and their Wi-Fi modem was giving off like 1,200 milligauss. And we tried to explain to her, this could be having effects on you, make you feel like you're being watched, and, things like that. It can have effects if you're sensitive to EMF. And she didn't want to hear it. She wanted to listen to the Psychic Friends Network that there was a demon in her house, so it's the confirmation bias is insane. Yeah, but people still want to play with the gadgets and the flashy lights and pendulums and Ouija boards and things like that. Now, with you being a parapsychologist, have you ever had something that you would call, not necessarily paranormal, but you believe was maybe a spirit or some kind of intelligent connection with something that we can't see or hear?
Maybe not so much intelligent connection. I mean, there was one instance that was quite interesting in Plesley Vale Mills. So it was an old cotton mills. So about several decades prior, sometimes 100 years ago, it would have had all of these looms on the third or fourth floor, just making sheets and sheets of textiles and fabric. But it's all empty now. It's been abandoned and it's used as office spaces. Some parts of that are just completely blank. It's just big rooms full of pillars, ceiling to floor, keeping each ceiling up. But it's where the looms would have been housed. And I used to go to Pleasantville Mills a lot with some friends who were police officers that was interested in some of the claims there that things have been moved about and doors have been opened when there was no signs of break-ins and things like that. And there was one time we were doing a walk around the building. We'd been there throughout the day and night. And we were there late one evening, and you could see outside all the spotlights were still on, really bright as well. So even on the third or fourth floor, with these massive windows everywhere, ceiling to floor, and probably at the bottom about 3 foot of brickwork before it got to the floor. So the windows really were filling up the walls. There was only one door into that main big room. It must have been about 40 yards across, something like that, really big. And there's one door in and out, and that's it. And everything's well lit. And we were in there. We're walking about with a camera, filming our walkarounds. Then you go back to the hub and make some notes and pop your data down, get a new notepad. And I think we were just throwing some rubble about in the room. Bear in mind, this is like 15 years ago or so. Throwing some rubble. And one of them said, oh, if anyone is there, they decided to speak out just for the fun of it because it's 2 a.m. We're getting very bored. And part of the floor, it's all a wooden floor, but the center of the floor has gone. It caved in, so they put some metal sheeting over it to fill in the gap. And so this colleague of mine, he throws some of this rubble out and he said, if anyone's there, throw it back. And he probably did it twice. So you heard this tap, 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 tap on the wood, ting, ting, ting on the metal, and then tap, tap, tap on the wood on the other side, and it slows down and stops. So he does this a couple of times. And then we said, that's it with them. We're going to go. We're going to keep walking on. If you're not going to do anything, we're going. Then all of a sudden, we heard this bang, tap, 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 ting, 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 tap, 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 tap. And coming out of the dark with that kind of 3 foot below the window frame, this rubble had come all the way across the room, that distance, that some 40-yard distance, all the way across, and landed by our feet and picked it up, and it was red hot. There's no radiators in there. There's no heating. It hadn't fallen down from anywhere. There was no one on the other side of the room throwing anything. So it was one of those moments where we just looked at each other and you sort of have a heart-sinking moment of, well, that's very coincidental. That's sort of come back on command and it's really hot. Why? Yeah. So that was quite unusual as an experience in a haunting case.
I think that, and see what you think about this, what do you think about the stone tape theory and with things being recorded on the environment? Because in my experience, I would say probably the majority of the haunting stuff that I've ever investigated, that's probably what it is. If there's any, and to me that theory makes sense with things being able to be recorded on the environment, because we can record magnetically on, acetate, on tape with VHS and cassette sound and images, and we're constantly surrounded by magnetic fields. So it would make sense to me scientifically that could, high energy things with trauma or somebody doing the same actions year after year in a place, that could replay back like a movie. What do you think about the stone tape theory?
It's very old school, the stone tape theory. I mean, when I was getting interested in any book I could get hold of on ghosts, there were mentions of this. And there are still a lot of old school ghost hunters talking about it. But in terms of science, it's not really been tested or has much of a basis, or is quite hard to demonstrate this idea that it was all based on, as you say, what if, like magnetic tape in a cassette tape or a VHS tape, memories and images are somehow recorded, emotions at a certain time, and then years later someone is in that place and there's a sort of playback. And it's perhaps because in the brickwork there are iron oxide particles within the brick and stone, and they have somehow recorded like a tape, like a magnetic tape, that impression. But how the playback happens is that bit of a mystery. How is your mind somehow interacting with that and causing playback for some people? Is it to do with your state of consciousness? Is it to do with altered states? Are we picking up on some memories of the past somehow? The only thing that I can think it relates to in recent times was, and I say recent times, I think the paper came out in 2006. It was in the European Journal of Parapsychology. There's an American parapsychologist who's lived here for a long time now, Dr. Richard Broughton. He wrote a brilliant book called Parapsychology, The Controversial Science back in 1991. It's very, very good. very autobiographical, but very informative of parapsychology. And so this paper in 2006 is called "Why Do Ghosts Wear Clothes?" And it's about trace memory. It's this idea of human memory, and if we're having an unusual experience, to what extent are our minds actually filling in the gap of what we expect to see, rather than what we are actually seeing? And so I think that's got a stronger link to anything that might be referred to as the stone tape theory, in that if we are in a bit of an altered state, if we're getting very tied in a location, or whatever else might be causing an altered state, we're so engrossed in what we're doing, it's causing this production of flow, which is a state of mind proposed by a psychologist called Malay Csikszentmihalyi. It's another way of talking about an altered state. Time flies when you're having fun. That again, our mind is filling in the gap of what we believe to be an exceptional experience, and we're seeing extra features that aren't actually there. So it could be that. There was even, and even then, there's questions to be had, there's things to test there. It's a working theory as to what might be going on and trying to understand the workings of the brain. Another theory besides stone tape, though, was water tape theory.
Yeah.
And there have been some articles that were pushed about regarding to what extent is water capable of actually storing images and information and being able to retrieve it. And some examples that were given of water's properties for that were how the molecular properties of the water in some studies have been changed depending on the emotions and state of mind of the scientists that have been working with the water. So that was the premise for it. So another idea was, if it's not iron oxide particles in the stone, is it something to do with moisture in the air and moisture in your own breath during the time you are thinking, feeling, having certain emotions about something, or an event takes place, which years later someone breathes in some of this moisture, and that triggers these state-dependent memories that you're seeing as some sort of hallucination. Again, it's an idea and a theory. It's nothing that I've written about or really tested in any way. I'd have to have a serious sit down and think about how you could test that. But I know beyond stone tape, water tape theory was proposed, and this whole trace memory idea.
Yeah. I don't want to stay on ghosts the whole time, because the paranormal is such a big world. I think the ghost community has kind of stolen the word paranormal, because you have everything from cryptids to poltergeist and psychokinesis and out-of-body experiences. So one of my big interests that I find fascinating is psychokinesis and poltergeist and that whole phenomena, and some of the studies that have been done on it over the years and some of the cases. What are your thoughts on psychokinesis as a real phenomenon? Because you have people like Uri Geller bending spoons, and then there's a famous case that's just come out. I think it was in Poland. There was a young girl they actually did studies on scientifically, and just while she was a teenager, she had these abilities, and they kind of went away.
Well, it's vast when it comes to psychokinesis. Uri Geller certainly wasn't the first person, and Uri is an interesting case. I speak to Uri about once a week. We just send interesting messages back and forth as to what we're up to and what we're doing. But what's going on there? When you read anything about his life, he starts off claiming that as a child he had unusual experiences and had some sort of gift. And then later on, as a teen and in his early 20s, he is training and performing as a professional magician. And then soon afterwards, professes that he can do some of these things legitimately without conjuring or misdirection. And then he's tested at the Stanford Research Institute by Hal Puthoff, Russell Targ, and Edgar Mitchell. And when you look at some of the footage of that, some of it, even though it's a loosely controlled experiment, some of it is quite compelling, such as him deflecting and changing a 1 gram weight on an electric weighing scale, where the weight is increased and decreased when he's not able to touch it. And they've already tested what it would look like if you were to bang one of the sealed containers that is protecting the weight, or kick the table, or jump on the floor to try and cause changes in the weighing scale. They looked at that. Something seems to be putting a force down on the weight and pulling up on the weight while he's got his hands near without touching it. But then later on, he goes back to doing media work, and a lot of that involves actually touching the spoons, touching the items, which, even though I'm no magician, I'm no conjurer, I can do similar feats as well if I'm allowed to touch the items. And there's various ways in which I can do it. He's a lovely guy, and I think there'd be a lot more interesting things to come if somehow we were able to get him back into the lab. But I had colleagues like Guy Playfair, who investigated the Enfield poltergeist. He'd written a book with Uri Geller on his abilities. And there's been many others besides. He's a bit of a mystery. And I know James Randi was pursuing him for years. James even did his own book called The Geller Effect. And I read some, when I was in D. Scott Rogo's archive in San Francisco at the Californian Institute for Integral Studies, Rogo's archive in the Rockefeller Library, there was so much postal correspondence that was in there. And Rogo had a copy of a letter from James Randi to Uri Geller saying, look, I know you're a conjurer. I know you're a magician. Please, please tell me that you're doing this via magic and you don't seriously think this is legitimate. If you tell me it's via magic and showmanship, please work with me. We could be such a good double act. I thought it was such a weird, groveling letter. It was quite creepy in many ways, whether, Uri is doing it via that or not. I mean, I've not studied it in that way, but I've read all the fors and all the against. But seeing this in the middle where Randi is pleading with him to work with him, there could be this great double act, like a sort of Penn and Teller in a way. Just absolutely bizarre. So those early Stanford research projects, that they are interesting, but sadly that was pretty much the main stuff that was documented. There's a whole book called the Geller Papers that was because of all of those studies that were published in some very prestigious journals of the time and caused a lot of controversy, and some journals thereafter refusing to publish any papers on parapsychology because of what they thought of Geller, or saying we will publish papers on parapsychology so long as the outcome of your finding is a null finding, as in you didn't find anything, which is extremely corrupt, really corrupt. But that's what happened. It caused a bit of a shift of the time. There are many other people, though. I mean, if you go way back to, say, the 1920s, there was Eleanor Zugan, who was known as the Romanian Devil Girl. She was studied by the ghost hunter Harry Price. She would make things spontaneously materialize within seances. She'd have random bite marks appearing on her and scratch marks, as though she was sort of possessed and followed by a poltergeist, but there were these psychokinetic effects she could control. There was Nina Kalagina in Russia. Lots of video footage of her moving matchsticks and cigarettes stood up on their end on the table, glass, plastic, fabric, so things that are non-magnetic, as well as magnetic items, which is deflecting a compass needle and things like that. And a lot of footage of that. And some of the arguments, skeptical arguments that have been, well, did she have a concealed magnet in her bra? Maybe, but not all the items are magnetic. Is this just the Russians during the Cold War trying to get one up on the US-based parapsychologists in terms of them being ahead of themselves in parapsychology than what was going on in the US at the time? Who knows? There's, again, a lot of controversy involved in that. Years later, you get what we're doing in the labs. And again, I come back to Richard Broughton because I was a research assistant for him when I was an undergraduate. And he was testing psychokinesis with some computer-based programs where you were trying to deflect a needle on a computer screen and program, trying to make the needle every time you click go into the green and avoid it going into the red. And you were trying to beat a random number generator's selection. You were trying to override it psychokinetically. So studies have progressed all the way through to that, where it's not trying to bend a piece of metal inside a sealed glass tube or deflect a compass needle or things like that. It's got to computer-based programs. With the Rhines in the 1920s and 30s, their very first studies of that were trying to will dice as you roll them to land on certain numbers, and then moving it from rolling them in your hand to pressing a button and a table would tip and throw the dice onto another table. So as they're in the air, you're trying to psychokinetically manipulate the dice to land on particular numbers. So it's gone through quite a transformation over time of testing the general public for this through to people like Geller and Nina Kalagina coming forward and many others and testing them for these claims. And in the middle of that, James Randi tried to break down some parapsychology labs because of it. He was successful with Project Alpha. He got I think it was an 18 and a 21-year-old that went to a parapsychology department and they said, we've got these abilities. And James Randi wanted the parapsychologist to say straight away, more or less, are you doing this via trickery? He expected them to do it straight away. He'd even rang the department and said, if you need any help, let me know. And some of this early footage went to a parapsychology conference for them to show colleagues, what do you think? They'd never gone through to formal tests. But all of this, James pushed it into the media and said, look, what fools. They've not realized that this is all trickery. And it embarrassed the university and the department. So they closed down parapsychology studies for them. Imagine if you did that with any other science. You went to an oncology research department and said, I've got cancer, treat me for cancer. Oh, have you not actually asked me whether I actually have it or not? Yeah. It's a very strange thing. You really want to shut down the oncology department or any science that's doing anything by going in and purposefully being deceptive? What are you trying to prove except for some very warped publicity? I've never really understood that, but he did try to follow it through with Project Beta, which was where he sent another young person to the University of Edinburgh under a very similar guise. But because everyone was so aware of Project Alpha, James Randi got called out pretty much straight away by Professor Deborah Delanoy for this young person that was sent along. And so, some of the studies are very impressive, and it's also moved over to biological systems. John Randall, he looked at psychokinesis with trying to influence the swimming patterns of microscopic pond life. They'd done psychokinetic studies with animals, trying to will them to go to certain paths or in certain directions. So there is some compelling data out there for it. In terms of day-to-day experiences of psychokinesis, people saying they've had a real world experience of it, the percentile is like 2 to 3% of people report it. Because how do you identify about the home that something, in your opinion, was psychokinetic? The mug in the kitchen is smashed on the floor. Well, who jumps to the conclusion that that's psychokinetic? Or who jumps to the conclusion that, well, actually there was a bit of moisture on the mug, or actually it was too close to the table edge anyway, or the kitchen counter? Or actually, I hit the counter and therefore it's caused vibration. And that's why it's for. There's so many conventional explanations. If you didn't see it slide across the table and then fly out and levitate a bit before dropping, then you're not really going to see it as psychokinetic. So it's very rare for people to report day-to-day accounts. But this is why people have stood out who claim that they can actually do it in terms of being able to control the psychokinetic effect.
Yeah, and I found it fascinating, too, with some of the famous poltergeist cases, with the psychokinesis connected to those as well. And one of the things that always interests me with the poltergeist cases as well is that it centers around mainly teenagers who are going through puberty and things, and mainly teenage girls. And then kind of as they get older, it kind of disappears. But just the thought that they may be creating a thought form that is doing things on their behalf, or without their knowing, I find really fascinating. And you're part of the Society for Psychical Research, and they have the famous Philip experiments with thought forms and things. And I've always found that fascinating as well. If you can create something like that has its own consciousness.
Well, everyone brings up Philip experiments, and I'm just surprised with yourself. And sometimes when I've given talks, the fact that outside of parapsychology, so many people seem to know this experiment. It's a very rare book now, as I'm sure you're aware, in paperback or hardback. It's a very scarce book to get hold of.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the British SPR. That was the Toronto Society for Psychical Research.
Okay.
And their idea, you're on point though, their idea was, what if we all have an agreement that we come up with a name and a personality for a deceased entity, and we give them some backstory, and then when we hold seances, we talk to this person. We actually create a character. And lo and behold, they start to get effects. So it tells us a lot about human psychology and group conformity, but there are effects happening as well that seem to be parapsychological, but it's not based on any known deceased individual. They have already, from the word go, said, we're going to make them up, but we're going to follow the story, and we're all going to agree to the story as well. So I think it was a very original idea that to that extent has never been replicated to that extent, and a very, very fascinating case. But as you say, a lot of people have tied poltergeist type cases down to adolescent females. But we've had some people like Guy Playfair and Alan Gould who've tried to push away a little bit this kind of myth that that's always the case with poltergeists. It certainly has happened in a lot of cases. The Enfield poltergeist, the Gyra ghost in the 1920s in Australia. There was a fairly youngish lady in the Rosenheim poltergeist case who was one of the secretaries at the law office. But there are many poltergeist cases where, yeah, there are people about, but it's not quite clear who that agent is, and there's not necessarily any young children either. But it has been interesting how in certain poltergeist cases, they are young and they're just starting puberty. That's when the activity seems to start. And after a few months or a couple of years, it randomly stops as well. So you've got some diehard investigators that have gone along and they've kept very thorough examination and reports of these cases, like they did with Enfield and some other ones as well, where we've looked at these people taken out of the location, the activity still occurs. They've had other experts come in to try and observe it for themselves. So yeah, we've had these very long-lasting cases, but it does take some very dedicated investigators. As you said, investigating hauntings is very boring. Well, look at a live poltergeist case. That's even more boring in some ways because you'll have days and days of sitting around doing nothing. And then all of a sudden there's a frenzy and a panic. What's going on? What are you all screaming for? And then you'll either catch something happening midpoint, not the beginning, or you'll catch the end of it. When you really want to see it happening at the start, if something has lifted up and flown across the room, you're catching it mid-flight, and where it's landed to, you're not seeing it lift up of its own accord, but there are other people bearing witness to that. So they're very confusing cases. I think my friend and colleague, Dr. Kieran O'Keefe, he's referred to this and some haunting cases before as being like a medic in a battlefield. Everything's happening. There's gunfire, there's explosions here and there, and you've got to tend to all the wounded, but who do you tend to first? You're spinning plates. It's really, for a scientist, it's a very much a chaotic environment to work in. But you've really got to be critical in your thinking. You've got to remain skeptical and keep that documentation as much as you can. As much as you are in that real world environment, a part of your mind has got to be stepping back as though you're looking through the window into the circumstance rather than reveling in what everyone else is experiencing as well. You're trying to be that level-headed observer.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. If you listen to the tapes that were recorded during the Enfield poltergeist, when they went in to investigate that, you can very much tell, like you're saying, they're even though they have all these recorders set up and like they're right outside the door with the recorder waiting on something to happen, it's very much kind of scrambling to try to get this stuff on film or even the audio of it happening and trying to figure out, because everybody, the mom's going crazy in the room, the kids are going crazy because something happened. And trying to weed through that without, like you said, seeing it from the start to the end. I've just found the poltergeist stuff and like it's connected with the psychokinesis and things really interesting. The Tulpa stuff with the Philip experiments.
Oh, Tulpamancy and Pukas. Yeah, again, that's really good in naming those in terms of, what was it? So we've got Donnie Darko. What was that film where someone had, it was before that, there was a black and white film where someone had the rabbit as their imaginary friend. Do you remember that title?
I know what you're talking about, and I can't think of it.
But that was like the first film example of that, where someone believes their imaginary friend so much that other people then eventually start to take it on. And there's been arguments that, with the case of Jeff the Talking Mongoose, that maybe that's what's going on there with Voyery, the daughter in the family, believing it so much.
Yeah.
It's an interesting phenomenon.
That case is crazy. Jeff the Talking Mongoose. I dove down that rabbit hole not too long ago, and I actually talked to a gentleman. He's with the New Zealand paranormal group, and he was actually traveling a few months ago over from New Zealand to check out the Jeff the Mongoose story. But if anybody's never dove into that, go. It's a fascinating story.
Well, it's so that there was a brilliant book just called Jeff, but he pronounced his name or spelt it G-E-F. But there is a book that's a brilliant summary and analysis by Christopher Joseph, just called G-E-F. So I recommend people check that out. But the original book has recently been reprinted with a foreword by Christopher Joseph. And it's a beautiful cloth bound printing. Do search it out on the internet and check it out. I've forgotten what company it is. Part of me wants to say Gilmore Press, but I might be wrong. But the original title is called The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. So you're going to have to do a Google search, because I don't think that book's available on Amazon. You've got to go straight to the publishers to order it. But I was always fascinated with that case and Borley Rectory. And then, of course, the well-known Enfield poltergeist is something that really was just out there so much. And there's been so many documentaries. The film The Conjuring has really kind of use so much poetic license with it. It's just completely a far cry from what the truth of the case is, especially suggesting that the Warrens, the Warrens were only briefly there, Ed and Lorraine Warren, for like a day or so. And so this idea that they had some sort of claim to fame or involvement in Enfield is just absolute nonsense. The SPR wanted them to just get out of the situation as soon as possible. It was though they were just completely fame hunting.
That seems like their MO. That seems like their motive back then, because it was kind of similar with the house that they went to at the Perrins in New England, and that whole thing. They showed up unannounced. They weren't invited by the family, and that's the first Conjuring movies based on that case. And they went in and they were thrown out, and I think the dad ended up punching Mr. Warren in the face, and there's a whole ordeal with that. But it seems like their MO. They would show up for a day, and then they tried to take all the credit for it, that they actually did something. Or, I don't like the Warrens. I think they were very much fame seeking, and
that happened in the Amityville case. There were 2 researchers sent from the American SPR at the same time as one person sent from the Psychical Research Foundation. So from the ASPR, that was Dr. Carlos Osis and Dr. Alex Tanis, and from the Psychical Research Foundation, they sent Dr. Jerry Solvin, and they went in and interviewed the family, trying to really get a grasp of what was going on. And as a couple of them interviewed the family, someone, it might have been Dr. Tanis, had gone in the kitchen and found in a drawer, just rummaging through, the contract that showed from the film companies and the book company, the publishers, that they were told to keep this story going. It was complete nonsense. There was no basis to the haunting story. It was made up for publicity purposes. And then as they're there, and Alex Tanis, as a professed medium and psychic, says, "I'm not feeling anything in this property." And that was before he found the contract. His attitude was, should we just go back to the ASPR now and sign off our report because we need to go? And as that happened, they saw the Warrens with a film crew or some local journalists coming in through the front door. So like, oh God, and they scarpered through the back door to get away from them because they knew that they wanted to be interviewed by them. There are some pictures that the Warrens clearly caught up with them because they've shoved a microphone in Alex Tanis's face. But I was reading the after reports where the Warrens had gone on the radio saying that Tanis claimed he'd seen the devil in the house and he'd levitated throughout the property. Yeah. Which I think he got his legal team involved to say that is absolutely not what happened whatsoever. Nothing is going on in the house. And that radio station needs to actually correct this and say, the truth, essentially. So, yeah, interesting case with the Warrens. But going back to Enfield, there's so many variations on that. Have you seen the recent documentary drama they've done on Apple TV? Have you seen that?
Yeah, that was genius, the way that they did the reenactment, exactly with the tapes. So it wasn't dramatized.
I'm glad you've seen that. Yeah, they just mime the tape recordings. They've taken the original tapes and the actors are miming it. It's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, to say, I knew Guy and I knew Morris. And it's just wonderful to actually, and people like Bernard Carr, that he's in it and he's also interviewed as well. Seeing these people that you've either known or still know and hearing their original voice at the time in that context, and they've just created the house again and they've got modern day actors. Yeah. It's freaky to watch. It puts you back there. And it also stops any poetic license. It stops them manipulating for drama purposes because you can't move outside of the confines of the audio recordings. Yeah. Yes, it depends on what the actors do in the context, but the audio is still giving some factual sides of things. So you can't move out of those confines. You've still got to tell it as the audio tells it.
Yeah, and I think it was still entertaining and compelling in the same way. So there's a way to do it in that way that still entertains the audience and still compelling without all the drama and melodrama and even fakery that you see with reenactments and all these other things on other shows. But yeah, that documentary is brilliant. And anybody interested in the Enfield case, definitely go check it out. So since I picked your brain about a lot of things that I'm interested in the paranormal, let's switch gears to your book, because this is another thing that I'm interested in. I've heard many stories throughout the years of this happening, even with the telephone calls from the dead, even with like 911. And the police getting calls and going to houses, and there's nobody there that could have called them. and they don't know what to make of it. But I find it fascinating. People getting voicemails nowadays with technology and text messages and things later. I find it very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, only last night I was at Cambridge talking to Cambridge Skeptics. So it's a group that meets in the pub and you get a speaker in. And I was talking on this topic because my book that came out in 2012, I wrote it and finished it by I was 21. It's been out of print for 6 years. And I just this last year have got back to it whenever I could to make some minor corrections and get it out as a permanent second printing. And also on Kindle because it was never on ebook before.
Yeah.
But one of the questions that was asked last night was even about radio waves. And I said, there's an interesting phenomena and that there's a couple of electrical engineers in the audience talking about these delays that can happen. And I had an ex-student who said, oh, you've got to read this book, Cal. It's really interesting. It's about K2 and climbers of it. But people that are at this kind of base at the bottom of the mountain who receive a lot of the radio transmissions from climbers, they've received radio transmissions from well-known dead climbers who died like a week or a couple of weeks prior. And they're getting radio transmissions from them. But they're not intelligent ones. It's not as though they're communicating. They're clearly past tense, from the time that they were alive.
Yeah.
But the question we brought up was, how is that somehow staying in the radio waves for a week or two before it then gets received, which, in the interim is quite eerie because in that time that person has died and yet we're receiving this sort of playback. It's not a recording, it's delayed in some way and it's been picked up. We even talked about that in the context of someone sending a text message, it gets delayed, they die, and then whoever they sent it to receives it. And depending on what's said, it could appear very eerie and as though they've had a text message from the dead.
Right.
But it's just more so the matter that for some very bizarre reason that doesn't happen often, it's been delayed and then later received after they've died. So, yeah, I've been looking at this for a long time. It's when I was an undergraduate student, I found the book Phone Calls from the Dead from 1979 by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless. And I'd seen a news article about a train collision that had happened in California between a commuter train and a freight train. And there was a gentleman involved called Charles Peck, who allegedly was ringing his family repeatedly, different mobile phones, and they knew this collision had happened. They'd seen it on the news. Whenever they picked up, they just heard static, and they were yelling words of encouragement and hope. Don't worry, the rescuers are on their way. When they called back, it just went straight to voicemail as though the phone was turned off or it was damaged or broken. And at 3:30 in the morning, when the rescuers found his body and he died on first impact, the family stopped receiving the mobile phone calls and the phone was never recovered, as though it was tossed in the collision, it was damaged. My opinion is it was just calling the last people in the call register, which would be his close family. He was on his way home anyway.
Yeah.
And, it's pushed against something. It's just repeatedly doing that until the battery dies out. But the interesting thing was the newspapers were pushing it as a phone call from the dead. And it clearly influenced the perceptions of the family as well when they realized he'd been dead from first impact. So why was the phone doing that? So I went back to Rogo and Bayless's book. I read it thoroughly and it was completely different. These are full-blown conversations with the known dead on the telephone or later discovering that person was dead at the time the call took place. So there are transcripts. There is information about what was said in the call. And there might be multiple witnesses or other people were handed the telephone receiver and spoke. And these were largely on landline telephones where there's less chance of manipulation as well. It's very raw telecommunication technology. So even as an undergraduate, I started looking into these cases, seeing if I could find any more of them. I was trying to see what remained of Scott Rogo's archive. And later on, after I'd finished my undergraduate degree in psychology and I'd focused at looking at the phenomenon of staring detection, knowing when someone is staring at you from the back of your head.
Yeah.
I was doing this on the sidelines. I was collecting these telephone cases. And by the end of 2011, I finished writing what is now the book Telephone Calls from the Dead, which acts as a sort of second edition to that original one from 1979. So if you read that, this follows on and tells you a bit more about the authors, but it works as a standalone book as well. And that original book has become very scarce, but in the coming months, we have got permission now to actually get that reprinted. So I'll be redoing that with a postscript as well. And I've gathered so much information over time. I could easily do a completely different book, completely rewritten, with at least another 4 or 5 chapters looking at different aspects of strange phenomena with the telephone. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, it's become one of those tropes in the paranormal. I know, at least in the U.S., that you'll occasionally hear stories that you can't necessarily vet, and it's not coming from firsthand. You know what I'm saying? Kind of like the lady in white's become a thing across all different cultures, and like the bride to be who died, and you still, or their fiance died, and now they're, forever mourning or whatever. But all these different tropes, like the hitchhikers and things like that. But I think it's become one of those now, to where every once in a while I'll hear a story about, police going to a house and the phone lines were cut, but they were called there, and 911 calls kept coming from there. But it's kind of the same story. It's kind of the same story of like the kids pushing the car over the railroad tracks if your car stalls on railroad tracks, certain place, and all these different places. They claim that is one of their local legends, but yet it happens in all these different. It supposedly happens in all these different towns, and all these different towns claim it as their local legend. But I find that fascinating that it kind of takes on a life of its own, where maybe there's, there are actual cases where maybe that does happen with issues with the 911 service or phone service or something, or even maybe something paranormal, but it's just becoming pervasive as a urban legend, and how some of the paranormal stuff turns into more urban legends, and all these people claim, this happened to my brother's cousin's uncle who was a cop, things like that. It's really interesting psychologically how those things kind of become pop culture.
See, I'd like to hear more about those. If anyone's had those experiences, and either directly or they know someone and they can put them in touch with me. I've mentioned cases of where people have unusual calls from people they don't recognize, or seemingly from the dead, where the main thing is not messages of comfort, but some sort of warning of a disaster to come, sort of precognitive in what they're suggesting. I haven't heard many that are directly involved with 911, or over here in the UK, 999. And emergency services, and something anomalous in those transmissions. So I would like to know more about those. I would like to interview people and collect their accounts, because I don't know of many. So it's interesting that you've heard of a few. I mean, I think in the back of my mind, I'm aware that, they're out there and people have had those strange experiences, but they haven't been documented with those specific calls, because pretty much all the calls I've talked about are either work-related or they're family and friend orientated. They're not to do with dialing the emergency services or received calls to the emergency services.
Yeah, one of the most famous that I've heard of those was 911 got a call from a lady, sounded like an elderly lady, saying somebody needs help at this house, at this address, and then would hang up, and then called back, but they didn't give the address, and called back and said somebody needs help at this address. And then when they get there, there was nobody else there but this elderly lady who had passed away like 24 hours prior. But they were getting these calls for somebody to come. And then the EMTs, they kind of jumped to conclusions, I guess, that, it had to be this lady. But somebody could have been there and just left. But they, from the tone of the voice and things, they thought it might have been, it's the ghost of the lady, who had passed away previous hours. And was trying to get somebody to come find her body, I guess. That's one that I've heard, and I've left out a lot of details, and I'll have to find out where that comes from. I'm trying to remember, I was talking to a guest when I first heard that story, and had to see if we can find the provenance for it and where it came from. But
yeah, please.
But yeah, I hear about those stories, like I said, every once in a while, with especially like abandoned buildings that don't have any power, or the phone lines are cut and police get calls there. Not necessarily anybody talking to them, but they'll get 911 calls, and they keep going back, and checking out the buildings, and there's, nobody there. And of course the phone line's not working.
I heard, it's not, there's a telephone involved in it, but that's not the anomalous aspect. But someone was telling me of a case yesterday when I was doing these talks, and it was kind of so beautiful in how it played out. And it was, I'm trying to think who exactly told it me, but it must have been in general discussion amongst folk there. But some lady had crashed her car, and it had gone into a ditch, and she'd passed out, and there was a lady up the road who had received a knock at the door from this lady that crashed her car in the ditch and said, I've had an accident. I need help. Could you call the police and an ambulance, please? So the elderly lady says, sure, absolutely. And she goes and calls 911 and gets them. She goes back to the door after she's made the call to check on this lady, and she's not there anymore. Well, that lady never actually went up to the house. She's still in the car unconscious.
Oh, wow.
And the emergency services turn up and sort out this lady. And when she comes to in the hospital later on after they treated her, she said, how on earth did you find me? And they said, well, there was a local resident who called to say that your car had crashed. And she was like, but how did she know? And so they went back to her because she said, I'd like to go and thank her. And they believed that just someone had turned up saying, I've seen a car's crash. Could you call 911? And she goes back to thank this old lady, and she knocks on the door and she answers the door and she says, oh, it's so good to see you again. How are you doing? I was so worried about you. And yet, it was, she'd never actually walked up to the house, what this woman had encountered, from how the events had played out and the fact that this woman had never left her vehicle.
Yeah.
She was still strapped in by the seatbelt and caught in the ditch. It's some sort of astral projection. She's seemingly gone to the door and asked for help. And this woman has found no trace of her whatsoever, but thought nothing of it, as though this woman has gone back to her car trying to get it out of the ditch, and she's just had a bit of a bump on the head. This woman who called 911 didn't know what was going on, or didn't really think she'd encountered an apparition. But the fact of the matter on the other side is no one went to the house.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. It ended up in the woman calling for help. And no one would have done had that strange experience not have taken place.
Right. That reminds me of something you would have seen on like Unsolved Mysteries back in the day when it was on.
Yeah.
Those type of stories always fascinated me on there. I heard you tell another story about astral projection that I found fascinating. You told it on another podcast about one of your colleague, Dr. Alex. I forget his last name.
Tennis, yeah.
Yeah, him having that and going to somebody's house and having tea with them.
Yeah, I mean, that is the most extreme version. I mean, Alex Tannis was tested at the American Society for Psychical Research and the Maimonides Medical Center for 20 years as a research subject, testing his alleged abilities to go out of body at will. And so various papers came out on those experiments. But in his day-to-day life, he'd had some unusual accounts that when people had them, they would write down their experiences and they would end up being sent to the American SPR for Dr. Carlos Osis to look into them, take further witness statements, and then get signed affidavits that people would swear in court that these witness statements are true to the best of their knowledge, and they would swear that. And there was one instance where he was staying at the American SPR as a research participant, and that night, while he was there in New York City, he dreamt of visiting a friend in Canada. Now, that friend in Canada had just gone to bed, and his wife had just gone to bed, and they hear a knock at the door, and he says to his wife, don't worry, I'll go down and see who it is. And he opens the door, and Alex is there, and he can see the guy's just gone to bed. And he says, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were just going to bed. And he said, I'll come back some other time. He goes, don't be so silly, Alex, come inside. And fixes him a drink, a cup of tea. They sit down, they have a very brief chat. And he said, look, we'll sort something else out later. We'll do a dinner or something. You go back to bed. But we will catch up. Thanks for inviting me in and having a quick catch up. And so he sees Alex out and he shuts the door, but he waits to check that he can hear Alex driving off in case he's having car trouble in the snow. But he doesn't hear anything. So he opens the door again just to look out and check on Alex. During this whole time, the wife upstairs heard conversations going on downstairs, but didn't come down. I don't think she stayed in bed reading or whatever she was doing. And so the guy opens the door to check for Alex, and there's no sign of Alex's car. There's no sign of any car that's just started up. In fact, looking down, there's no sign of any footprints in the snow, freshly laid before the door and the steps, leading up to the door or away from the door. There are no new footprints.
Wow.
No sign of Alex. Alex wakes up the next morning and writes down his experiences, believing that he has gone out of body during his dream to have this experience. The man also, knowing Alex, recognizes it to be a very strange experience, writes down his experience, and the wife, in terms of having heard that her husband was downstairs having a conversation, writes down her part of witness testimony, and they get sent to Carlos Osis. So that was one instance. The whole claim of the fact that he sat down and had a cup of tea with him.
Yeah.
And yet, there's no trace of him outside. It sounds extremely far-fetched, but it's just one of a number of examples, and also is the reason why he was tested for so long at the ASPR and Maimonides Medical Center. I mean, I could put to you a number of conventional and skeptical assumptions as to what's going on there, but the fact that this was a consistent claim that kept coming up is a bit puzzling and bizarre, but it's not devoid of some conventional explanations, but that's what he was known for.
Yeah. Fascinating story, nonetheless. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm sorry that we're all over the place. I just wanted to pick your brain about different topics. So,
no worries. I mean, I think I've never met your audience before, so everyone that's listening, hello. We can stick to a consistent topic next time. You've had a bit of everything. You've had a lovely pick and mix of all the gorgeous candy of parapsychology that is on offer. But we can talk about telephone calls just on its own next time. We can talk about research we've done on flotation tanks. We can just talk about bereavement and after-death communications. I'm involved in so many different projects. I've got 11 different doctoral students that are working on various aspects of parapsychology. So there's a number of topics to get very thorough and in-depth on. So we can always do that at a later date. It's been a pleasure speaking to you about a bit of everything today. Yeah,
thank you so much. You're the only the second parapsychologist I ever had on. Dr. Elliot Van Dusen is the only other one I've ever had on, and he's a great guy. I don't know if you know him or not. Out of Canada.
No, I've never heard.
He's a retired RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and he's a parapsychologist, and great guy to talk to as well. But again, thank you so much for coming on and giving me your time. And we'll definitely have you back on and dive into some of your research. Especially, I'd like to get into the deprivation tanks and stuff, and also your work with the death and bereavement and those type of things. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Eric. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
All right, everybody. Y'all stay safe out there. We'll see you next time. Have a good day. Thank you for listening to The Unseen Paranormal. Join me next Wednesday with a brand new guest. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. This helps more people discover the show. You can connect with me over on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or join us in the Unseen Paranormal Lounge group on Facebook. Until next time, remember, some of the scariest things are unseen. You have come